events. To understand this classification of events in the general fact of the ingression of blue into nature, let us confine attention to one situation for one percipient event, and to the consequent roles of the conditioning events, for the ingression is thus limited. The percipient event is the relevant bodily state of the observer. The situation is where he sees the blue, say behind the mirror. The active conditioning events are the events whose characters are particularly relevant for the event, which is the situation, to be the situation for that percipient event, namely the coat, the mirror, and the state of the room as to light and atmosphere. The passive conditioning events are the events of the rest of nature. In general, the situation is an active conditioning event, namely the coat itself, when there is no mirror or other contrivance to produce abnormal effects. But the example of the mirror shows us that the situation may be one of those passive conditioning events. We are then apt to say that our senses have been cheated, because we demand as a right that the situation should be an active condition in the ingression. This demand is not so baseless as it may seem when presented as I have put it. All we know of the characters of the events of nature is based on the analysis of the relations of situations to percipient events. If situations were not in general active conditions, this analysis would tell us nothing. Nature would be an unfathomable enigma to us, and there could be no science. Accordingly, the incipient discontent when a situation is found to be a passive condition is in a sense justifiable. Because if that sort of thing went on too often, the role of the intellect would be ended. Furthermore, the mirror is itself the situation of other sense objects, either for the same observer with the same percipient event, or for other observers with other percipient events. Thus, the fact that an event is a situation in the ingression of one set of sense objects into nature is presumptive evidence that that event is an active condition in the ingression of other sense objects into nature which may have other situations. This is a fundamental principle of science which it is derived from common sense. I now turn to perceptual objects. When we look at the coat, we do not in general say, there is a patch of Cambridge blue. What naturally occurs to us is, there is a coat. Also, the judgment that what we have seen is a garment of a man's attire is a detail. What we perceive is an object other than a mere sense object. It is not a mere patch of color, but something more, and it is that something more which we judge to be a coat. I will use the word coat as the name for that crude object which is more than a patch of color, without any allusion to the judgments as to its usefulness as an article of attire either in the past or the future. The coat which is perceived, in this sense of the word coat, is what I call a perceptual object. We have to investigate the general nature of these perceptual objects. It is a law of nature that in general the situation of a sense object is not only the situation of that sense object for one definite percipient event, but is the situation of a variety of sense objects for a variety of percipient events. For example, for any one percipient event, the situation of a sense object of sight is apt also to be the situations of sense objects of sight, of touch, of smell, and of sound. Furthermore, this concurrence in the situations of sense objects has led to the body, i.e., the percipient event, so adapting itself that the perception of one sense object in a certain situation leads to a subconscious sense awareness of other sense objects in the same situation. This interplay is especially the case between touch and sight. There is a certain correlation between the ingressions of sense objects of touch and sense objects of sight into nature, and in a slighter degree between the ingressions of other pairs of sense objects. I call this sort of correlation the conveyance of one sense object by another. When you see the blue flannel coat, you subconsciously feel yourself wearing it, or otherwise touching it. If you are a smoker, you may also subconsciously be aware of the faint aroma of tobacco. The peculiar fact posited by this sense awareness of the concurrence of subconscious sense objects along with one or more dominating sense objects in the same situation is the sense awareness of the perceptual object. The perceptual object is not primarily the issue of a judgment. It is a factor of nature directly posited in sense awareness. The element of judgment comes in when we proceed to classify the particular perceptual object. For example, we say, "That is flannel," and we think of the properties of flannel and the uses of athletes' coats. But that all takes place after we have got hold of the perceptual object. Anticipatory judgments affect the perceptual object perceived by focusing and directing attention. The perceptual object is the outcome of the habit of experience. Anything which conflicts with this habit hinders the sense awareness of such an object. A sense object is not the product of the association of intellectual ideas. It is the product of the association of sense objects in the same situation. This outcome is not intellectual. It is an object of peculiar type with its own particular ingression into nature. There are two kinds of perceptual objects, namely, delusive perceptual objects and physical objects. The situation of a delusive perceptual object is a passive condition in the ingression of that object into nature. Also, the event which is the situation will have the relation of situation to the object only for one particular percipient event. For example, an observer sees the image of the blue coat in a mirror. It is a blue coat that he sees, and not a mere patch of color. This shows that the active conditions for the conveyance of a group of subconscious sense objects by a dominating sense object are to be found in the percipient event. Namely, we are to look for them in the investigations of medical psychologists. The ingression into nature of the delusive sense object is conditioned by the adaptation of bodily events to the more normal occurrence, which is the ingression of the physical object. A perceptual object is a physical object when 1. Its object is an active conditioning event for the ingression of any of its component sense objects, and 2. The same event can be the situation of the perceptual object for an indefinite number of possible percipient events. Physical objects are the ordinary events which we perceive when our senses are not cheated, such as chairs, tables, and trees. In a way, physical objects have more insistent perceptive power than sense objects. Attention to the fact of their occurrence in nature is the first condition for the survival of complex living organisms. The result of this high perceptive power of physical objects is the scholastic philosophy of nature, which looks on the sense objects as mere attributes of the physical objects. This scholastic point of view is directly contradicted by the wealth of sense objects which enter into our experience as situated in events without any connection with physical objects. For example, stray smells, sounds, colors, and more subtle nameless senseless objects. There is no perception of physical objects without perception of sense objects, but the converse does not hold. Namely, there is abundant perception of sense objects unaccompanied by any perception of physical objects. This lack of reciprocity in the relations between sense objects and physical objects is fatal to the scholastic natural philosophy. There is a great difference in the roles of the situations of sense objects and physical objects. The situations of a physical object are conditioned by uniqueness and continuity. The uniqueness is an ideal limit to which we approximate as we proceed in thought along an abstract set of durations, considering smaller and smaller durations in the approach to the ideal limit of the moment of time. In other words, when the duration is small enough, the situation of the physical object within that duration is practically unique. The identification of the same physical object as being situated in distinct events and distinct durations is effected by the condition of continuity. This condition of continuity is the condition that a continuity of passage of events, each event being a situation of the object in its corresponding duration, can be found from the earlier to the later of the two given events. So far as the two events are practically adjacent in one specious present, this continuity